Welcome back. We are almost finished migrating our ASP.NET app over to ASP.NET Core. The one big area that we haven't addressed yet is the fact that there are static files served by our ASP.NET app that will need to be served by the ASP.NET Core app instead. So in this video, we're going to take a look at the changes we need to make to serve static content from our ASP.NET Core app instead of from the ASP.NET app. So let's jump in. There's actually a few different types of static files that our ASP.NET web app is serving. There are items like these fonts and images that are served directly via HTTP request. So our views will just include a link to these images or these fonts, and they will be served directly by the ASP.NET app. And so those are going to work. Those are going to work very easily in the ASP.NET Core app because we can include them as static content there. We also have these pics. So this pics folder includes pictures of items in the catalog, so different pictures of different products. And these are a little bit different because these images are served via a controller. We have a pics controller, which is responsible for loading these from disk and then returning them to the user. So they're not served directly. This is because you might have a pics controller that loads things from Azure Blob Storage or from a database or from on disk. And so again, we'll move these over, but we'll have to make just a few changes to the controller so that it can serve them from the ASP.NET Core app's content route. But again, it's pretty straightforward. And then finally, we have scripts like these JavaScript files and some in the content folder, some CSS style sheets that we need to use. And these get a little bit more complicated because if you take a look in the app start folder of our app, we have this bundle config, which uses System.Web.Optimization features to bundle and minify these scripts and style sheets together so that in our layout page or in a view, those Razor pages can just make a request for content/CSS, and what's returned is a bundled and minified compilation of all of these style sheets that's produced dynamically by the ASP.NET app. So at runtime, the ASP.NET app will take the jQuery file and it will minify it into something called bundles/jQuery to be made available. Now the challenge here is that the System.Web.Optimization APIs are not available in ASP.NET Core. ASP.NET Core does not have a built-in way to do this sort of bundling and minification. So we're going to have to change the way this works. There are some good options though. I would argue probably even better than what was available in ASP.NET. So we'll walk through what that transition looks like. Let's start with the easy ones though. Things like our images and fonts that we serve directly, ASP.NET Core has middleware to serve static files. So all we need to do is we're going to create a www root folder in our ASP.NET Core app because ASP.NET Core by default will serve static files from the www root folder. So we add that folder. Here it is, and you can see VS even gives it a special icon because we know that this is a special folder for ASP.NET Core apps. And then in my program.cs, I'm going to double check that we have the static file middleware registered. We do. So we have app.useStaticFiles here, which comes in most of our new project templates. And so it's probably already present. If not, you would have to add this line so that the ASP.NET Core app is able to serve files from the www root folder. And you can see that when you add this, there are a few options that you can specify that will include things like where to serve files from, how to serve them, and so on. But the default is typically fine. So now we're just going to take these fonts and images. I'm going to copy those. I'm going to copy those folders. And then in the www root folder in the ASP.NET Core app, I'm going to paste them. And it's that simple. So now when we launch our app, if someone requests, for example, /images/brand.png, the ASP.NET Core app, by virtue of the static file middleware, will look in the www root folder, and if it finds something with that path, it returns it. Okay, that one was pretty easy. Next up, let's grab our pics folder, and we're going to copy that, and we are going to paste that in the ASP.NET Core app. Now, in this case, we're not putting it in www root because we don't expect users to request those images directly. Instead, these are files that are going to be present in our build output and in our publish output, but not served directly out of www root. Instead, they're just going to be made available for the app to use. So let's double check in our CS proj that that's happened correctly. You can see here that Visual Studio has automatically removed all of these and included them as content, which is good. But rather than have all of these lines for all of these different files, in ASP.NET Core, we can actually, well, that's not ASP.NET Core specific, using the new SDK style projects, we can use wildcards here to make this a lot shorter. So I'm just going to paste in here that we would like to include all PNGs in the pics folder as content. And importantly, we're going to specify that we do want these copied to the output directory so that when we build, when we publish, these pics will be available to be used by other parts of the application. Now, because they're not in www root, they won't get served, but they'll be available on the server side. Now, I said that these are served by a controller. We have this thing called pic controller, which is responsible when a request comes in for a particular catalog item's picture. It goes, it makes sure that that item exists, and then it will find the image on disk, and it will return a response including that image. So as before, we're going to migrate this controller, and we can use the VS extension for incremental migration. So we're just going to right-click, say migrate. We see here that there's really nothing new here. We're using our catalog service. We're using log4net. These have all already been migrated over into our core app, so that's going to be fine. We have this default route, which is already present. So this is going to be a very easy migration. I click migrate. A little work happens here. Okay. And then if we come look at our ASP.NET Core app, we now have a pic controller. And you can see this is the same controller with a few small changes made, like we've changed the namespaces to be ASP.NET Core appropriate. And it's getting the catalog service via dependency injection. It's using the logger retrieved from Log Manager. And this is all generally going to work. Now, as before, we're going to have to make a few small fix-ups in our controller to finish this migration. But in this case, there's really only a handful. So here we need to pass this to status code result as an int. So I cast that to an integer. Down here, instead of HTTP not found, we want not found as the name of our helper method in ASP.NET Core. And then the only interesting one is here where we were using this Server.MapPath in ASP.NET as a way of finding where the pics folder is relative to the application's binary folder on disk. Server.MapPath doesn't exist anymore, but we do have a host environment service that can give us information about the environment we're running in. So I'm actually going to come up here to the constructor. I'm going to request an IHostEnvironment argument as from DI, and then we'll say this dot environment equals environment. We'll have VS create that field for us. Okay, and, we can make this read only. Okay, so now we're getting an IHostEnvironment instance out of our DI container when we construct our pic controller. So now down here, we actually can say that this root that we're loading pictures from is going to be a combination of environment. We're using that service now. Content root path. Content root path refers to the directory where this app has been deployed, where all of the binaries are, where any content lives. And so that's going to be our root. And then the pictures are all being placed in the pics directory because we're just copying them with the same relative path. And so here, we've now got a new root that we're able to combine with the file name. And this is all we need to do here. Now, let's see, for some reason, is this just out of date? It looks like it is. I bet maybe I can close and reopen this controller. And I've got a preview version of VS, so I get a little bit of funniness sometimes. Okay, so this controller is ready to go. Now, you may also remember when we migrated our catalog controller, we actually commented out a reference to the pic controller because it wasn't migrated yet. This is where we've got this helper method that creates the URL where catalog items pictures can be retrieved from so that we can populate them on the catalog page. We had commented this out previously and just kind of hard-coded a URL that would get routed back to the ASP.NET app. Now that we have a pick controller, we can go back to using route URL as a way of, a little bit more elegantly determining where to get this from in case the controller were to move or the route were to change. The only thing we have to change here is if I try build this, you'll see there's one build error here. Request.url doesn't exist anymore, but instead we can just do request.scheme directly, and that will work. Okay, so VS is really not being very nice with keeping the squiggles up to date. Apologize for that. But you can see it's giving me an error here that request.url doesn't exist. But instead, many of the properties that were on request.url are now available directly on the request object. So we're just going to use this .request.scheme instead. And at this point, I'll go ahead and build to make sure everything's at least building. But we should be able to have both the pictures and the images and fonts served via our ASP.NET Core app. And it does say down here, build succeeded. So that's good. Now comes the interesting one. We need to move our JavaScript and our CSS. Now, of course, we already in program.cs have this use static files middleware. So we can serve static files, but we don't want to serve the files directly because our views are depending on minified and bundled versions of them, not the raw versions of these JS and CSS files. So there's a couple options here. We no longer have the System.Web.Optimization namespace, but there are some third-party options that actually do this very well. Let me show you some of those. The first one I would point out would be any sort of tool that is sort of created for the purpose of bundling and minifying JavaScript and CSS. Probably the most common of these is going to be Webpack. There are other tools out there like Gulp that you could use as well, but Webpack is a third-party tool whose purpose is at build time to intelligently bundle and minify static content, things like HTML, JavaScript, CSS, images, and so on. Now, there is a little bit of a ramp up that you're going to have if you start using Webpack, but this is sort of the industry standard for how modern applications solve this problem. So I think the best solution here is to use Webpack. It's going to have sort of the best-in-class features and flexibility for bundling and minifying however you need with your static files. And this can actually happen at build time, and then you'll just deploy those already bundled and minified files with your app in the www root folder, and they will be served directly by the static file middleware. Again, though, even though I think this is the best long-term solution, it does take a little bit of learning to get started with Webpack. So another option I like to tell people about is this WebOptimizer project. Now, this is not an official Microsoft project. It's a third-party open source project, but it was created and is maintained by a Microsoft engineer. And this adds bundling and minification functionality to ASP.NET Core. So it'll have the ability, similar to System Web Optimization, to, at runtime, take some set of JavaScript or CSS, and the first time some bundled version of those is requested, it'll do all the bundling, it'll do the minification, it'll return those, it'll cache those results so that performance is good. And so this project is going to give you the closest parallel to the way things worked in ASP.NET, so it's usually the quickest to get started with. If you look here, there's some documentation on how to get started with this library and how you can use it as a replacement for System Web Optimization. So in this case, let's go ahead and start using this Web Optimizer package because it's the quickest path forward, knowing that eventually we'd probably want to replace it with something like Webpack. Okay, so in order to do that, we are first going to add a NuGet dependency to our ASP.NET Core app. We're going to search for LigerShark.WebOptimizer. Okay, and let's see, LigerShark, there's LigerShark.WebOptimizer core. That's what we want. Okay, I'm going to say install. It's going to download these NuGet packages for us. Agree to that. Okay, so this is now installed, we see. So now let's go ahead and configure it. And even here you can see we've added the reference in our project file. So the first thing we're going to do is we need to add middleware for it. And we need to add the middleware before use static files. So in here, I'm going to add app.use System.Web.Optimizer. There are options that you can pass in, which aren't typically necessary. This is just adding into the middleware pipeline that we want to serve these bundled files. Now, the more interesting part is up above where we set up our services. We need to configure the Web Optimizer with configuration telling it what we want to bundle and minify. So let's go ahead and take a look at how this was happening previously in bundle config. We can see that, okay, the jQuery script was going directly to jQuery. jQuery val.validate was going to jQuery val. Here we've got both Bootstrap and Respond.js bundling into Bootstrap. And then we've got these 4 CSS files bundling into CSS. So what we're going to do is we can't reuse the syntax, but we can look at what these rules are and rewrite these same rules in our Web Optimizer configuration over here in our ASP.NET Core app. So up here where we are working with our services, I am going to go ahead and paste in the code that we need for that, and we'll walk through it. Okay. So here we are saying that we are adding the Web Optimizer services to our DI container, and then we're configuring these different bundles. Here's our jQuery bundle, jQuery val. You can see these are all the same rules that we had previously, but now they're written in the configuration of this Web Optimizer component. In some cases, you can see that we have multiple JS files or multiple CSS files being bundled together, and that works sort of as expected. And this is really all we need to do here. You can see we do have use content root, saying that that's where we're pulling all of our JavaScript and CSS from, because there's no reason for the raw files to be in www root. We're not going to serve them directly, no reason to expose them. And so at this point, we can go ahead and copy over our JavaScript and CSS. So I will grab, let's see, both of those, and we'll do that. Okay, so we will take, let's see, content, and we'll take scripts. I'm going to copy those, and I'm just going to paste them in my ASP.NET Core app. Now again, the same way that we kind of cleaned up the CS_proj file after pasting our images, we can come in here and you can see that this has gotten kind of large with all of these individual JS and CSS files. Let me get rid of that. All we need is for them to be content that is copied. And so again, we can use some wildcards. And so what I'll do, we've already got an item group that's sort of managing this sort of stuff. I'm just going to add 2 more items. We're going to add all content and all scripts, like all files in either of those, as content that needs to be copied when we build. Okay. And got that copied. The next thing we would need to do is go ahead and look at our views to make sure that we're using these correctly, but this should already be taken care of. If we go look in layout.cshtml, we had previously commented out styles.render and scripts.render, but you may remember we replaced it with link and script tags that were loading those same URLs, but they were being loaded from the ASP.NET app. These will continue to work now, but instead they're going to come from the ASP.NET Core app. So at this point, I'm going to delete this, but the actual functional part of our layout CSHTML isn't changing at all. This is all ready to go. So at this point, everything should be working. We can launch this, but to prove that it's working and we're not only loading things from ASP.NET, let's go ahead and actually delete the static content from the ASP.NET app, since we don't need it there anymore. We no longer need fonts, images, we don't need pics, we don't need content, we don't need scripts, because all of these are being served by the ASP.NET Core app. So even if the ASP.NET app needs them, when it requests back to the server for some of the static content, the ASP.NET Core app will serve it. So I'm going to just delete those. We will also, of course, have to delete our bundle config, since that was using those and we're no longer using bundle config. And then in our global ASAX, let's just get rid of bundle config. All right, so we've simplified our ASP.NET app a little bit, and the ASP.NET Core app has replaced that functionality. So now, knock on wood, I did everything right. We're going to launch this and see what happens. So we'll wait for it to build for a minute here. And then we will check out the page. Okay, build succeeded. We're now launching both the ASP.NET and ASP.NET Core apps side by side, hopefully with all of the static content coming from the core side now instead of from ASP.NET. Okay, here's our catalog index page, and you can see we are getting pictures via the controller, we're getting images via static files, and everything is styled right, so we're getting CSS via the bundling and minification, and it is working as expected. The page looks no different, but we're now migrated a little bit more of our app. And if we go to the session endpoint, which you may remember is served by the ASP.NET app, it also is able to access all of those same static files. So at this point, we've moved pretty much all of our application over to core, minus just a couple more controllers that would come over trivially at this point. And so we are well on our way to having this ASP.NET app migrated to ASP.NET Core. With the static files taken care of, next we're going to take a look at how you can actually deploy something like this even when you still have both applications, because one of the key benefits of incremental migration is that you don't need to wait for the entire migration to finish before you deploy updates. So we'll take this project as it is now, with most of the project on ASP.NET Core, some functionality including auth still on ASP.NET, and we will deploy it into Azure App Service. Hope to see you back for that video. Thanks.